He stood up on the church pew and asked a question that stopped the entire room. If love is real, why does it look so sad? In that moment, Elon Musk's 5-year-old son shattered the silence, and something extraordinary began to unfold. No one knew it yet, but this child was about to start a movement. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of Grace Community Church, casting soft patterns of blue, gold, and crimson across the pews. It was a typical Sunday morning, quiet, steady, familiar. Hymnals sat undisturbed, the choir rustled softly behind the altar. Then the sanctuary door creaked open. Elon Musk stepped inside, hand in hand with his 5-year-old son, X. There were no photographers, no team, no noise, just a father and child moving slowly down the side aisle. People began to turn their heads. Some whispered. Others simply stared. It wasn't just the presence of a world-famous billionaire that drew their attention. It was the absence of anything performative. Elon wasn't here to speak. He wasn't here to lead. He wasn't even here to be noticed. He walked with the posture of someone unsure, maybe even searching. X wore sneakers that lit up every time he stepped. He clutched a tiny plush rocket and kept his eyes wide, scanning the stained glass, the vaulted ceiling, the wooden beams. As they sat near the back, he leaned into his father and whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Is this where God lives?" The question made a few heads turn, and then, a few heartbeats later, he pointed toward the front and asked gently, "Why does love look so sad?" X stood slowly, slipping out from the pew before Elon could stop him. His light-up shoes flickered with each step as he walked straight down the center aisle of the quiet church. The sanctuary was hushed. Heads turned. A few gasps echoed softly off the stone walls. The pastor, already on his way to the pulpit, paused and stepped down to meet the child at eye level. "Hey there, buddy," the pastor said kindly, kneeling slightly. "Is everything okay?" X looked around, wide-eyed. "Can I say something with your microphone?" The pastor hesitated for a breath, then handed the mic to the boy, resting a steadying hand on his shoulder. X turned to face the congregation. The microphone looked too large in his tiny hands, but his voice, though small, cut through the stillness. "If God made hugs and moms and puppies," he asked, "why would he want to be mad?" The room stood still. "And why do people stop loving each other?" he added, his voice catching for a moment. Not a single person moved. The question didn't feel like it came from a child. It felt older, deeper, like something the whole room had been avoiding. What began as a question had now become a revelation. Elon hadn't meant to come to church that morning. Not really. Not in the way others did, with folded hands or open hearts. For most of his life, his faith had been in numbers, in systems, in the precision of engineering. His late nights were spent in labs, not sanctuaries. He raised rockets, not questions about God. The cosmos, for Elon, was a landscape to conquer, not a mystery to kneel before. But things changed when X came along. Bedtime wasn't quiet in their house. It was filled with questions. "Where stars so quiet, Dad? Doth God get tired of listening?" At first, Elon had offered half answers, safe ones that could be backed by science or softened with humor. But he always sensed that X was reaching for something more. And lately, those questions had started to echo, not just in the hallway at bedtime, but in Elon's chest. He remembered a moment from long ago, a kitchen in South Africa. His mother, gently folding laundry, had once said without looking up, "Even the smartest minds need something to believe in." He didn't respond then. He didn't know how. But now, in this small sanctuary, that long-ago whisper felt loud. because now he was watching his son ask the questions he never dared to voice. And suddenly Elon wasn't the teacher anymore. He was the student. He came here thinking he would observe quietly from the back row, just a father, honoring his son's wish to visit a place where people talked to God. But X hadn't come to sit still. He hadn't come to behave. He came to awaken something Elon didn't even realize had fallen asleep. Elon came to observe, but X came to awaken something bigger. X gripped the microphone with both hands. His shoes blinked faintly beneath him, the lights almost in rhythm with the rising hush that filled the sanctuary. The room wasn't silent out of formality. It was sacred stillness, like the whole building was leaning in to hear something it had forgotten. "Sometimes," X began softly, "when I feel sad, I sit really still." He looked around the room, blinking into the soft glows of stained glass, "and I pretend I'm being hugged by someone invisible. I think maybe that's God." There was a pause, not of disbelief, but of something deeper, recognition, like 100 adults had just remembered a version of themselves they hadn't met in years. A man in a navy blue suit slowly stood near the middle pew. "I forgot what it feels like to believe," he said, voice trembling. "I spent so long needing proof that I stopped needing love." He sat down without another word, but the silence didn't last. A woman with red-rimmed eyes near the back rose next. "My son died in a car crash 2 years ago," she whispered. "I've been angry. At the driver, at myself, at God. But when that little boy said he felt hugged when he was sad, I remembered what that used to feel like." A teenage girl, hair streaked purple, stood slowly from the third row. "I stopped coming here after my parents' divorce," she said. "I didn't think anyone noticed me anymore, but today, I do feel seen." X said nothing. He just stood, his eyes wide but calm, watching the room shift, not because of noise, but because of the quiet unraveling of hurt. The pastor remained off to the side, his eyes glistening. He hadn't preached a word, but something was being preached, and another man stood, then another, each with a story, pain not polished into testimony, just real, raw offerings. The sanctuary, once neat and restrained, now pulsed with open hearts. People who hadn't spoken in years looked at each other differently. Hugs replaced handshakes. Tears softened even the hardest expressions. And through it all, X simply stood. Then he stepped one pace forward. His voice, small but steady, filled the room again. "Do you think," he paused, glancing at the wooden cross, "love gets tired?" A few gasps, a couple sobs, but no one answered. Because they all had asked it too, silently at some point, when life had bent them past breaking. X blinked again. "Maybe love doesn't leave," he added. "Maybe it just gets quiet, when people stop listening." That was when the room broke wide open. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from the side of the sanctuary, a soft, unsteady voice broke the stillness. A man in a wheelchair rolled slowly toward the front. His hands trembled slightly on the wheels. He looked like someone who hadn't spoken in front of others in years. "My name's Walter," he said, his voice gravelly. "I used to coach Little League before the crash took my legs. And my wife. Same night." Gasps swept quietly through the pews. "I thought God was punishing me," Walter continued. "For years, I've sat in the back of this church and said nothing. Just breathed and laughed." He looked over at X, who was now sitting quietly in Elon's lap. "But today, a little boy reminded me that love doesn't leave. We just stopped looking for it." No one clapped. No one needed to. Then another man stood up, 2 pews back, his face red with emotion. "I left my family last month," he said. "Thought walking away would hurt less than staying and failing." He glanced at X. But that boy, he made me remember why I even started. Not to be perfect, just to love. The man pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. I'm going to call my wife right now. A few nodded. One woman reached for her husband's hand. Then, slowly, another voice rose from the back. I've been in this church since 1949, an older woman said, her voice steady with age. And I've never seen anything like this. I think I've waited 70 years to hear what that child said today. Pastor Michael didn't speak. He stood near the pulpit, his eyes glossy, hands folded, not leading, just witnessing. Everywhere, people sat on the edges of their seats, some holding hands, others letting silent tears fall. Elon sat, frozen. He wasn't a public speaker here. He wasn't the richest man in the world. He was a father holding a 5-year-old boy who had somehow cracked open the heart of an entire congregation. X leaned his head against Elon's chest, his small arms wrapped around his father's arm. Elon swallowed hard. I didn't expect this, he whispered to himself. He had come for a quiet Sunday morning, maybe some peace. Instead, the walls of the church now held confession, forgiveness, and grace, not from a sermon, but from spontaneous honesty. Then, at Elon's chest, X stirred. He sat up slowly and tugged gently at Elon's sleeve. Daddy, he whispered, just loud enough for a few nearby to hear. Can I say one last thing? Elon hesitated. His hands tightened protectively, instinctively. He looked into his son's eyes. Still calm, still wide, still certain. He nodded. Pastor Michael, catching the moment from afar, stepped aside again. The room, already hushed, fell deeper into silence. No one knew what this boy would say next. But they knew whatever it was worth listening to. X slid off Elon's lap slowly. His legs were tired, but his eyes were focused. The room watched in utter silence as the boy walked forward, the soft glow of his sneakers flashing gently with each step. Pastor Michael waited at the base of the pulpit, extending a hand to steady him as he climbed the 3 wooden steps. X stepped to the microphone. He gripped the sides of the podium, his fingers barely curling around its edge. The mic stood taller than him, but his voice, though soft, reached every ear. My dad says the best stories have a twist at the end, X began, blinking slowly into the light, like when the sad part isn't the last part. The room held still. I think maybe, he continued, all of us are in the middle part. But that doesn't mean the end is bad. Maybe it just means the good part's coming. There was a long, sacred pause. A few people wiped away tears. Some bowed their heads. Others simply stood, unmoving, their breath caught in their throats. Then, as if one heart had moved them all, the congregation slowly rose to their feet. First in stunned silence. Then a ripple of clapping began. Quiet, reverent. Not loud, but full of awe. Pastor Michael stood at the side of the pulpit, his hand pressed over his chest. His voice cracked as he stepped back to the microphone. No sermon I prepared, he said, could do what this child just did today. He turned and looked out at the people, many crying, others still stunned. We came expecting a quiet service. We leave transformed. From outside the building, a low hum grew louder. Whispers, footsteps, the shuffle of those gathering. The live stream had spread far beyond the sanctuary, and now, drawn by curiosity, by reverence, or maybe by something they couldn't name, more people were arriving. Strangers leaned in the doorway, young and old, some weeping quietly, some just watching. A woman with a baby stood just inside the entrance, rocking gently. A teen boy with purple streaks in his hair sat cross-legged on the floor. They didn't know each other, but none of that mattered now. The atmosphere was different, weightless, sacred. The little boy stood down from the platform. Pastor Michael helped him step carefully back to the floor, then turned again to the mic. "We didn't plan this," he said, "but maybe God did." As murmurs of agreement moved through the pews, a man in the far back, a quiet man in a worn flannel shirt, raised his hand. His voice was low but clear. "Can I say something?" Pastor Michael nodded. The man pointed toward the doors. I think we should open them." The pastor blinked. "To let people in?" The man shook his head slowly. "No, to let love out." For a breathless second, no one moved. Then someone whispered, "Yes." Another voice said softly, "Please." Pastor Michael turned to the ushers and nodded. "Open them." The doors creaked on their hinges, and in that single motion, it was as if something sacred passed through. Like spirit, like wind, like truth. Elon stood near the front, holding his son again. They didn't speak, but the moment said everything. The open doors let in more than sunlight. They let in life. People poured into the sanctuary and flowed back out onto the street. It was no longer just a church service. It had become a gathering, a quiet revival of hearts. On the lawn, strangers prayed in circles. Some stood in silence. Others fell into hugs without needing to explain why. And then, softly, from the back of the room, someone began to sing. No piano, no choir. Just a voice. Thin and unsure at first, then steadier. Another joined in, then another. Soon, the sanctuary echoed with a patchwork of melody. It wasn't a rehearsed hymn. It was a new sound. A sound that felt ancient and personal all at once. Gravelly, raw, beautiful. A woman near the center, silver hair pinned neatly in a bun, stood with her hands clasped gently over her chest. "I've been in this church since I was baptized here in 1952, she said softly to the people near her, "and I think I've waited 70 years to hear what that boy just said." In the far corner, a teen girl with purple streaks in her hair stood up slowly, her voice trembling. "Last week, I tried to hurt myself," she admitted, not looking at anyone in particular. "I thought nobody would care. I felt invisible." She looked directly at X. "But when he said that love doesn't get tired," she said, her voice cracking, "I felt like someone finally saw me. And maybe I don't have to give up." She sat down, and those near her reached to touch her hand, her shoulder, her knee, quiet gestures that said, "You're not alone." Near the front, Elon held X in his arms again. The little boy was tired now, resting his head on his father's chest. Elon kissed the top of his head, whispering something no one could hear. And then, in a voice barely audible, X mumbled, "I think this was the good part." Elon closed his eyes, not to shut the moment out, but to hold it inside. The murmur of song still hung in the air. Outside, the breeze moved gently through the open doors, lifting the edges of bulletin papers and carrying the scent of spring. No one needed permission to stay. No one wanted to leave. There was no sermon, no program, no instructions. And yet, somehow, everyone knew what to do. They listened. They cried. They remembered. In a room without a script, love wrote the story. Later that evening, back home, the house was unusually quiet. Elon stood alone in his study, a soft desk lamp casting a warm circle of light on the table. In his hands was a single piece of folded paper. X's crayon drawing of the cross, colored roughly in red and brown, with a child's uneven handwriting beneath it. Love shouldn't look sad. Elon stared at it for a long moment, then gently placed it into a plain manila folder. He labeled the tab in pencil, Church. Not for show, not for press, just to keep it safe. Outside, the sun had dipped behind the trees, and soft amber light filtered through the windows. Elon walked down the hallway and peeked into X's room. The little boy was curled up on his bed, surrounded by a fortress of stuffed animals. His shoes, the ones that lit up, were tossed near the door, one still blinking faintly. Elon stepped in quietly, knelt by the bed, and brushed a strand of hair from X's forehead. The boy stirred, opened one eye, and smiled sleepily. "What's happened, but Elon?" "Hey, buddy," Elon whispered. "You awake?" X nodded a little. "Was I too loud in church?" "No," Elon said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were perfect." X blinked, then asked softly, "Do you think people remembered today?" Elon hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew how much it mattered. "Bella did," he said firmly. "They really did." The boy let out a content sigh and rolled onto his back. After a pause, he asked, "Do you think love can spread, like rocket fuel?" That caught Elon off guard. He looked at his son and smiled, one of those quiet, full smiles that only come when your heart's been completely rearranged. "I think," he said slowly, "it already is." Later, as they drove through the winding hills back from town, X leaned his head against the car window. Outside, the sky was beginning to fill with stars, one by one blinking into view, like old friends returning home. The roads were quiet, but Elon didn't turn on the radio. Some silences didn't need filling. In the rearview mirror, he saw X's reflection. Tired eyes, soft cheeks, and a quiet expression of peace. What had started as an ordinary Sunday had become something no one could have scripted. Not in the sanctuary, not in the streets, and certainly not in the heart of a 5-year-old boy. But Elon knew something now. What happened in that church didn't end. It began. Later that night, Elon sat alone on the back porch, the stars overhead barely visible through the California haze. He held his phone in one hand, the screen dim, the cursor blinking over an empty caption box. His thumb hovered above the keyboard, then pulled back. He wasn't ready to speak. Not to the press, not to the world. Some stories didn't need to be explained. They just needed to be remembered. Instead of writing, he opened the photo gallery. There was a single image. X standing at the front of that small church, just beneath the wooden cross, his sneakers glowing faintly, his little face tilted upward, wide-eyed, unafraid. Behind him, the stained glass shimmered. Around him, people stood in awe. It was more than a picture. It was a moment captured in stillness, a quiet kind of miracle. Elon saved the photo to a private folder. No hashtags, no statement. Just a father keeping record of the moment the world stood still. Not for a headline, but for a whisper. And maybe that's what made it powerful. Because sometimes the most sacred voices aren't the loudest. They're the ones that come wrapped in small hands and soft questions. The ones that ask if love can spread like rocket fuel. The ones that don't preach, but simply wonder. If you've forgotten what love feels like, maybe this story is your sign to remember. Maybe you don't need a stage, or a microphone, or a pulpit. Maybe you just need to listen. To a child, to a stranger, to the part of yourself that still believes. And if this story stirred something in you, don't let that feeling go. Hold on to it. Let it grow. Let it move you towards someone you haven't called, something you haven't forgiven, or a silence you've been too afraid to sit in. Subscribe for more inspiring stories about love, healing, and the quiet voices that change everything. Because sometimes love doesn't raise its voice. Sometimes it just waits for us to listen.